So this is our Q&A session on the Eucharist, also known as the Mass, also known as Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper. I think there's a lot of other names that the prayer book lists out for it. A lot of different names right off the bat. So the idea of this Q&A is we're going to be talking more about Holy Communion, Holy Eucharist, Mass for our formation during Lent. And so I kind of wanted to get a sense of what questions might be, because that'll help me as I'm formulating what the class is going to look like. So if you've got questions, we've got a few on the docket, but if you guys have questions who are here now, please ask them. And those online, whether you're joining later or whatnot, just add your questions into the chat, and I'll make sure to look at that from time to time so we can answer those questions too. All right.
Here's a question. All right, well, here's one. In the talk about my two for a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
There's four different, not mistaken, my math might be wrong. There's four different Eucharistic prayers and 6 different prayers of the people. That's a possible 24 combinations of prayers. Then you have 2 versions of the Lord's Prayer, that's 48. Then you have 2 versions of the Apostles' Creed, that's 96. And then if you go to the right one, you got another 24. There's 120 different services you can do just for the liturgy without even going through the never mind the different song reading.
Right.
I'm curious why they did. I mean, it sounds to me like a liturgy that was developed by a committee that couldn't decide what they wanted. And they said, well, hey, you like the Memorial Eucharist prayer, let's put that in there, let's put that in there. Okay, is that why do they have so many variants that a church could do 2 years of services that would never be the same?
This is a good question, which we can go a lot of different directions with this. So the point being made, particularly if you look at the right 2 options in the Book of Common Prayer, there's a lot of different options, and that ranges from, I'll talk about the big ones first with the prayers of the people and the Eucharistic prayers. So 6 different prayers of the people versions, and 4 Eucharistic prayers. And then we've got some other options too throughout the service and in Rite 1 as well. In fact, Rite 1, there's 2 prayers. Though I don't think I've ever seen a church use prayer 2 for that. So there's a lot of options, and then the question is why, and then how how did we come to have the prayer book that we have? There was a committee, and it was a committee of people. So this has been as there have been talks in recent years about what the next prayer book might look like. And for anyone that concerns, don't worry. I have not been paying quite as much attention to that as I used to, but one of the folks that was on the one of the initial committees to look into it was my liturgics professor. And I remember talking with him after a friend's ordination and saying that his recommendation to General Convention was we need more time. And part of that was on that committee, I think he was one of 2 PhD folks that were involved. There were a lot more than that with the 1979 prayer book. There were years that they put into it. So, I mean, one of the concerns has been, are we going to have the same level of scholarship? So I think that, so that's kind of the story behind that. The options, I think, was just for that reason, to give people options for prayers. for how to do the Eucharist itself, even, which I think is a good thing. And granted, while 4 Eucharistic prayers and rite 2 may seem like a lot, common worship in the Church of England, so common worship being their workarounds, it takes an act of parliament to make a new prayer book. There were a lot of failed attempts in the 20th century to get a new prayer book in England. So the workaround was these alternate liturgies, which more or less are the prayer book there. I think they have up to H, if I recall, which I may not be recalling correctly. So we could have a lot more options than we do. But I think that's really just to allow people different ways to worship. There's one of the things we may be talking about further on. I don't want to get like too heady with this. A lot of the Eucharistic prayers we have, the format for them, and I'd have to look at exactly what all makes it a specific format versus the other. It's just how some of the key elements are ordered in the prayer. A lot of them are West Syrian, so that follows more the Eastern Church. There was a push, and this is the interesting thing for the Anglican service book. This is the only prayer that's not translated into the traditional language from the contemporary, which I find ironic for a lot of reasons. There was a push to have a prayer that was in the Roman Alexandrian form, which is what the Roman Catholic Church would use. I think a lot of the people on the committee didn't want that. So there's like all kinds of, the rumors I've heard is like it was one guy who did prayer C, which again is not, we don't have a traditional language version of that in the Anglican service book. And it's a kind of wacky prayer, but there's some really beautiful parts to it. There's this one bit, it's called the Star Wars prayer by some people, because of this part that says, the vast expanse of interstellar space and this fragile earth, our island home, which I actually really love that bit. Of course, unfortunately now I can't hear it without having the Star Wars theme play in my head. But the rumor, the 2 rumors I've heard is it was one guy whose name I can't remember, who constructed that prayer. And he did it like really late at night after eating like a bag of Cheetos. The other rumor I've heard is it was another guy whose name I can't remember, who was up late with a bottle of scotch and he constructed that prayer. So there's that too. I think like getting down to like the nitty gritty of like, you know, who did what. There's a great resource out there if you have insomnia and you like, I mean, I really like it, but I spent 3 years studying this stuff. It's Marian Hatchett's commentary on the prayer book. It'll give you all the history and stuff. Occasionally it'll give you who wrote this prayer or that prayer. But not always. So I think the idea, even within the committee, was that it was less about them and more about what are they offering to the church. And a lot of the differences in the prayers, and I'll kind of use this to segue into another question we had before the class. The different prayers that we have, we're trying to go back, and this is, it's good we're kind of getting into this because this is something that I want to talk about with some of the history later on. But with the 79 prayer book, they were trying to go back to the early church. So that's why in some ways the 79 prayer book seems so different, is that the prayers were less about what we've been doing since 1778, I think is when the first American prayer book was on, and I'm probably wrong about that. So people watching later, you can put in the comments how I got that wrong or right or whatever. But it's been a while since for the Episcopal Church, so we've kind of followed this same pattern for worship. 28, I would argue, is actually the first really radical prayer book, because they added in prayers for the dead. Because think of the time, 28, so you've got in living memory World War One as like a atrociously awful war. There's a pandemic going on during the war too. This does not at all sound like anything going on in the world now. But the prayers for the dead were really needed for folks. And so those got added in. And that was a huge change when you really think about it. But the 79 went further in the changes. And really it was to get back to what was the early church doing. So that's why it does look very different from past prayer books. The closest we have is Rite One, Prayer One. And that's a prayer. It's the oldest prayer we have in the Book of Common Prayer. It's also the oldest prayer as far as Eucharistic prayers go in the Anglican Service Book. But it's basically it's a version of what Cranmer wrote. So if you compare our prayer to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer that Church of England still uses, it's similar. It's not the exact same. So there's certain elements, and we'll be talking about this more in later classes too, or at least I hope so. Cranmer, keep in mind, was a Protestant. He had what we'd say is a very low view of the Eucharist. He was trying to move away from the Roman Church with the whole, like, this is, all of a sudden the bread and wine, they become Jesus. It's not that he didn't think communion was important. It's that he just didn't think that there was anything except in the heart of the believer that was going on. Keep in mind that's the very same view of Calvin as well, who's very influential on Cranmer. So Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, did a lot of things to the Eucharistic prayer to downplay that. An interesting thing in our history in the Episcopal Church is we almost weren't Episcopal. Episcopal means bishop, that you've got bishops. There was a big push to not have bishops, led by none other than Bishop William Wright, who was our first bishop in this diocese of Pennsylvania. He changed his tune when they offered to make him a bishop. Then it was okay. But before him was Samuel Seabury. And unfortunately for Hamilton fans, yes, it's that Samuel Seabury. He was very much a monarchist. And while it wouldn't have been public, that track that Lin-Manuel Miranda put to music, it wouldn't have been public that was him. But he did put out a tract in defense of monarchy. So he was the one that was supposed to be the first bishop. The problem is that to have a bishop, to ordain a bishop, you need 3 bishops. We did not have any bishops at that time. So the first place we went to was Church of England. At the time, Church of England said, well, you've got to swear the oath to the monarchy. Like that's what you do when you're ordained. And that's by the way, a practice that still goes on today. I had several friends when I studied at Westcott House who were very frustrated by that particular oath that you have to take. So when England didn't work out, we went to Scotland, the Protestant Episcopal Church in Scotland, called that because they have bishops, and they're not the Church of Scotland. The Church of Scotland is the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the official state church. So we went to the Episcopalians in Scotland, and they said they'd be fine to ordain us, to ordain Bishop Seabury. One condition was this Eucharistic prayer. So that's why we have this particular Eucharistic prayer, which is based on Cranmer's, but adds in things like the blessing and sanctifying the elements. That's something Cranmer never would have had in there. I think it takes what would have been the post-communion prayer for Cranmer and adds that back into the main Eucharistic prayer. For those who have ever been to this service with Cranmer's prayer, the 1662 prayer book, it's the ending is very jarring, particularly when you get used to our prayers. So that's why that's in there for our Eucharistic prayer. And like I said, it's an older prayer because it's based on Cranmer's, so all the way back to the start of the Church of England. But it's got some of those additions that we got from Scotland. Now, William White was ordained bishop by Church of England bishops, because at that point they said, "Oh, fine, you don't have to do the oath, we'll ordain you." And then there was another bishop after him whose name escapes me, unfortunately. And then we had 3 bishops, and we've been good ever since. Maybe, but anyways, so yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer all the particulars for how the committee work exactly worked for the prayer book, because there's a lot that I don't know, because it's I'm sure it's there. It's just you have to dig deep, like go into very specific libraries for very specific information. But yeah, what I can say is they had an idea of how the prayer book was going to work as they all came together. And then the testing with like the Green Book and the Zebra Book and all of that was a way to figure out what was going to work best. And there were some things that got changed because of those trial liturgies, like confirmation getting added technically back in. There wasn't a separate, all the confirmation stuff was part of the baptism stuff before. But then a lot of people were like, we really want confirmation in there. And so they added it as a separate service, but it's still pretty much, there's not really anything in there that you can't go to the baptism service for. But anyways.
You're talking about the broader book, which that's a different discussion. Really.
Yeah.
Hours and hours about the whole prayer book and history.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. The fact that we're pulling away more from the Anglican roots and going back to the earlier church with some of the prayers and some of the practices, but that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think that's
talking about the Eucharist.
Right. Yeah. We should focus on the Eucharist for now. Yeah, but I think we see that in the Eucharist too. Yeah, and that's a good point, is that in some ways we're moving a little away from the historic Anglican prayers. Although we keep it in there with Right One Prayer One. Yeah, and we're moving more, that is the idea of moving more towards the ancient church as much as we can. There's just not a lot that we know about how they practice the Eucharist. I mean, what we have in scripture is really, really scant. But we've been able to learn more through archaeology and other things to see kind of how the early church did it. And one thing that I will say when we start going through some of this history too, in more detail, particularly with Cranmer, particularly with the Eucharist, is one of the things I learned in church history. You see this particularly in monastic groups, is that every 100 years there's a push to go back to like the way things used to be, like how things should be, and they always kind of miss the mark just a little bit. I'm someone who definitely leans towards the ancient Christians and how we did things. I mean, I'm a St. John student. I love the Greeks. It's hard for me not to look back. However, there are a lot of things that we know now that they didn't then, or that we understand better that the early Christians didn't. Jesus, as the Son of God, as like what that truly means. I mean, that's where most of the early church arguments came out of, was figuring that out. And the Holy Spirit is another. I think about the Creed, how scant that is. Like there's just a little bit about the Holy Spirit. The early church really struggled with that. I personally don't really understand that, because the Holy Spirit is just God being present in us. That makes a lot more sense to me than how do we have this guy who's both God and man, but like it's not like some like God man meld. It's like fully God and fully man at the same time. Like he's both these two distinct things. It's, you have to it takes a while to wrap your head around it. Which is not to go against any Orthodox understanding of that. It's just these are difficult things that we have spent centuries dealing with. And I think you see that in those prayers too. That trying to be trying to fit the ancient ways, but also trying to bring in our current understanding of things. I mean, you see it with prayer one too. It's looking at the words that Cranmer wrote, but adding in some words that explain our understanding of the Eucharist now, which when we go over that is going to be in the Episcopal Church. Our understanding of what's going on in Eucharist is mostly a shrug, non-committal shrug, because the idea is we're allowing for different views there, which I think is a good thing. Another thing we pointed out, though, that does have to do with the Eucharist, there is a contemporary option of the Lord's Prayer. I think the only time I ever saw that used, I shouldn't say that. One of the only times that I saw it used a lot was in seminary, because we had some professors that were insistent on that. Most churches go for the traditional language because it's what people know and are comfortable with. I think we have to realize, though, at the same time, our traditional language version is not the same as other denominations' traditional language version, as my wife will has constantly pointed out. Ours is different from the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. So, and I think that's something to think about. The Nicene Creed is a really interesting one, because the we, for that's more the contemporary language ish. The we believe versus I believe. We believe is actually what we should be doing. I would argue, because it's the closest to the actual creed of Nicaea Constantinople. The language in that creed was we. If we want to go back to the Greek, it's we, which will come to me what that what the actual word for we is later for Greek. But the I language, the I believe, that history is really interesting, and something I think we'll talk about in some of the history too. it's it came about because in the Middle Ages, a lot of priests started saying Mass on their own, and it doesn't make sense to say we believe. It makes more sense to say I believe. I'd have to go back and look. I think that's the version in the 1662, which is based on Cranmer's final prayer book in 1552, before Bloody Mary chopped off his, or no, burned him at the stake. Whatever it was, she killed him. I think that's probably left over from the Middle Ages. I think knowing Cranmer's approach to a lot of things, I think he would have gone with we, if he'd known what we know now with that. So that's why that particular option's in there. But there's also the I believe, because a lot of people grew up with that. And the 79 prayer book was hard enough for people to take hold of. So there are a lot of little things in there to help ease the way. Anyways, we're I wanted to try to keep us at 20 minutes, but we may go a little longer. Are there any other questions?
You mentioned something about the prayer of humble access.
Yeah. So right now we're what we're using for the prayer of humble access doesn't have the optional bits for the Anglican service book, mostly to kind of, basically the idea of that for us was in Lent we're doing prayer 1. We're at St. Luke's, we're a church that's been using the Anglican service book, as our leaders of the search committee sent out their letter saying, our consultant said that may prevent us from being able to find suitable candidates that we use the Anglican service book. So what I wanted to show with Lent, I'd already been thinking about being more penitential, having prayer 1. But I wanted to show the ways in which we could do that within the Anglican service book and for it to still be what's in the prayer book. So the Anglican service book has an extra line in there that our sinful bodies may be made clean by his body and our souls washed through his most precious blood. My understanding is that comes from the 1928 prayer book, which is no longer our official prayer book for the Episcopal Church. It's just a relic of history, if you will. But those words were in there. They got taken out for the 79 prayer book for the prayer of humble access. I don't know the exact reasons. I would suspect it was just to soften things a little bit, to soften the penitentialness with it. But I'd have to go back and look. A lot of the prayers for Cranmer like that, because that was Cranmer's prayer, the prayer of humble access. I think even that would have been worded a little differently. With the whole Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us bit, which the way it's worded is problematic from a theological perspective, because Christ made that Passover once for all many, many years ago. And in fact, Cranmer's original prayer, like with the whole Christ our Passover, is much longer, and it included that in there. So a lot of things we got from Cranmer we've shortened over time. The prayer of humble access is one of them. In fact, I think it used to be in a different location in the Eucharistic service, which is what a lot of people have issues with it now, because, well, we've already said the confession. Why do we need to say this now? We've already confessed our sins. Why do we need this now? The prayer of humble access, I think, was originally done before the Eucharistic prayer, which would have made a lot more sense, because you're going. It's our prayer as we get ready to go into our service. But I'm hoping that answered the question on the prayer of humble access. I'll say there are a lot of us that, and I include myself in this, that love that prayer. Um, it can be a little jarring. Depending on what else you have in the service, it can be can seem overly penitential. Um, but um, but it's such a beautiful prayer. It really is. Any other questions? I'm going to throw in one that I received before about the common cup, where that particular phrase comes from, which is a good question. I haven't really been able to find out like a full answer. We've been using it now to kind of talk about our return to some of the Eucharistic elements that we had before. One being, in the early church, you wouldn't have been denied communion, which happened in the Middle Ages. And you certainly would have received in most part, in both kinds, because you would have just had bread, you would have wine. And it would have been probably in somebody's house that you were doing it. But it's interesting. I was looking it up in Galatians. Paul talks about a conflict he had with Peter. And it was basically who Peter was eating with. That because there was this whole divide with the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians. As we've heard about in the community classes. And it kind of came down to who's more holy, in a sense. Paul, as a Jew, and Peter, as a Jew, were both in the God is letting Gentiles in. This is a new thing that God is working. But Peter sometimes would be having meals only with the Jewish Christians, and there are other just favoritism things that Paul got all up about and talked to Peter about it directly, and talks about it in Galatians. And Peter's response being like, you're right, I shouldn't have been doing this. But the idea there being, even in the early church, it was important for everybody to be able to participate in communion. In the Middle Ages, with the idea of Jesus being like that the body, that the bread and wine were the body and blood, there is this fear now. So that's where we get wafers from. Wafers, you don't get crumbs. So there's not little specks of Jesus lying around that we have to worry about. Same with the wine. In fact, there's a film about Martin Luther. I cannot for the life of me. It's a very famous actor who played him, but I cannot for the life of me remember who it was. And it came out, I want to say like 15 years ago. It might have been 20 years now, who knows. It was a really good film. And it starts with baby Luther as he's a new priest at the Mass. And he spills a little bit of wine and he kind of runs away, essentially, which he probably didn't spill, but he talks about, like he talks in his letters, correspondences, his writings, about being deathly afraid of spilling the wine. And that's why sometimes in the Roman Catholic Church, even today, even pre-pandemic, you wouldn't always get the wine at churches, is there's still this fear of that, which the Reformation kind of took us out of. Now, we say the Episcopal Church, you can receive in either kind. And I was asked too where that comes from, and I'm not exactly sure, I have to admit. My speculation would be, not everyone in the world does bread and wine. Bread and wine, yeast is not available everywhere in the world. Wine is not, that fermentation process is not available everywhere in the world. And the church has long seen that, for example, rice patties and sake, perfectly legitimate substitute. So we do bread and wine partly to remember the history and to live into that moment of the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples. But at the same time, either kind is okay. And there are some circumstances too where someone cannot receive in both kinds. Allergies that people may have to certain wines is one thing. Alcoholism is another. And I've seen people kiss the cup instead of receiving it. I've seen people just take the cup and not do anything else with it. There's a lot of workarounds there. There's also non-alcoholic wine too. And I've been to services for groups that were majority recovering alcoholics, that was the one. You had non-alcoholic wine. There were no other options. So the receiving in one kind, I think, really stems from that idea too, that we don't always have the same materials that Jesus and the disciples would have, but we can't substitute. And again, I think at the end of the day, most of us would stand behind, Eucharist is not a Eucharist without other people there, 2 or 3 gathered together, as Jesus says in his name. And I think the other thing that many of us, myself and my colleagues, would say is if communion's offered, it should be offered to as many people as possible. The pandemic tested that for us for a while, and that's why, at least, I was in Alabama at the time. We were doing morning prayer for a really long time. I didn't celebrate a Eucharist again after the shutdown until, well, I take it back. I did. I think I did one with my folks for Easter morning, after I'd done all the vigil stuff and all the post online for everything with that. But I didn't do one in church until the beginning of 2021. So, which was a long time to go without doing it. But yeah, part of that was we weren't able to gather as a people. So we did morning prayer, and so the Eucharist. So, all right. As we close, any other questions? I think I got everything. Let me check our chat and see if there's any. I don't see any there. Any others? Okay. Well, this is good. This gives me some ideas. I know we love our history at St. Luke's, which is good. And I've already been thinking about that as a primary thing, but going through the different prayers too, I think will be was something I'd already had in mind, and I think that would be another good thing too. So this is good. And if anyone has any other questions later, if you're online, post them. You can always give them to me later too. So we're gonna shut down for the day, and thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being with us online too. See you soon.